Okay, guys, so this is our third session on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the first third of the story and then look at some of the themes therein, hopefully. Now, you might have noticed I try to keep these videos limited to 30 minutes, 25 minutes, and so forth. That should give you time to pause and think and, do what you need to do to basically reflect on the text and whatnot, and write down any questions that you might have. So before we begin with the text, why exactly are we reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and why are we going to come and read the Odyssey of Homer and all of these stories, right? And why is it that these stories continue to play a role in contemporary literature, right? Why is it that we still read these stories? Well, one of the things we discussed last week was that there are certain elements and themes that pertain to the human condition, right? And when a theme, when an idea, or when a text discusses something that pertains to the human condition, then inevitably, right, that text will have some sort of timelessness to it, right? It will remain relevant. Now, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are multiple themes that pertain to the human condition, and we want to look at two of them in particular. The first is the idea of relationships, and how relationships lead to self-discovery, or how relationships lead to the opposite of self-discovery, which is egoism, or the aesthetic life, which we will define as we proceed. So in the common lecture, they give you a background to the historical background. So I'm not really going to go into that. Instead, I'm going to dive straight into the plot. So part one, we want to talk about, again, the issue of the I-thou relationship in particular, and I'll explain what I mean by that, by the I-thou. And again, its relationship to the issue of authenticity and inauthenticity, which we will explain what we mean by authenticity and inauthenticity. So we start off with, the book starts off with a description of this despotic, unruly king, right, named Gilgamesh, right, the king of Uruk. And the narrative, I mean, mentions some things. For example, that he is very powerful. He has, this physical strength to him. That he is 2/3 God, 1/3 human, and it also draws our attention, and this is what is important, to the relationship that he has with the people of the city, right? We know that he takes the brides on their wedding nights, right? That he is violent and so forth. So the text begins by drawing our attention to the relationship between Gilgamesh and the people of that city. Now, given that we are trying to understand the human condition, we are trying to understand the 1/3 part of Gilgamesh, which is his human side. And as a king at this stage, there are two characteristics that capture and that can describe for us the type of person and the type of king that Gilgamesh is. The first is that he lives an aesthetic life. Now, aesthetic is the opposite, or it is contrasted to the ethical, right? So to live an aesthetic life is to live a life that is driven by one's impulses, right? By one's innate desires and so forth. And we will delve into this a bit later. The second important characteristic of Gilgamesh at this stage is egoism. He is completely self-absorbed. Now, egoism is an important concept when trying to understand how someone relates to the other. So one can relate to the other in an egotistical way, or one can relate to the other in a more dialectic way. So an egoistic relationship to the other is a relationship in which the I or the self acts as the only pole of meaning, right? And the other in for example, in the bride or the people of Uruk are deemed and reduced to the status of objects. So in the first opening passages, we have the king who is in this aesthetic state and who is driven by a sense of egoism. And egoism, as we will see, acts as the barrier between Gilgamesh, right, and self-reflection. Why? Because he's completely self-absorbed, right? Now, as time passes, the text mentions that the people of the city begin to complain, right? They begin to complain and they plead to the gods to intervene, to in some way control Gilgamesh or depose him or something of that sort. And so the gods agree and they come up with a plot and they decide to intervene, but they intervene indirectly. And the plot is that the idea is that they are going to create someone who will match the strength and the courage of who? Of Gilgamesh. And they come up with this character named Enkidu. Okay? Enkidu is 2/3 animal and 1/3 human. And so the text goes on to describe Enkidu. And in describing Enkidu, it provides us with a juxtaposition, right? With a contrast to Gilgamesh. So what is interesting is that while Enkidu belongs to the animal kingdom, therefore in modern terms he is barbaric, right? We find that he acts in a somewhat of a moral way, right? We find that he coexists with the animals, that he even frees the animals from their traps, and he appears to exhibit a sort of natural ethics, right? Whereas Gilgamesh, right, who is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, and is supposedly in modern terms civilized, lacks morality, right, and is violent. So this is where we begin to find the contrast, and this is where things begin to get interesting. And this is where we begin to think and reflect about the question of what does it mean to be human, right? What exactly is the human condition? So we have this contrast between the paradoxically moral, barbaric, and ethical Enkidu in the animal kingdom, and Gilgamesh, the man of the city, the king of the city, who is 2/3 god, 1/3 human, supposedly civilized, right? And yet he is violent and immoral. Now, the similarity up until now, despite this contrast between Enkidu and Gilgamesh, is that they both lack self-awareness. None of them yet exhibit any sort of self-reflection. but instead they are still immersed in the day-to-day world, right? The everyday exercise of violence and power and desire for Gilgamesh, or the task of survival for Enkidu. Now, in the same way, the people of Uruk ask the gods to intervene to stop Gilgamesh. We find that there's also a similar incident occurs where one of the hunters stumbles across Enkidu, this two-legged monster, and he finds Enkidu destroying his livelihood, right? The crops, because Enkidu is, still part of the animal kingdom. And the hunter is disturbed by the fact that Enkidu is freeing the animals from their traps. And so the hunter relays this message to the city of Uruk, to Gilgamesh. And so similarly, like the gods, Gilgamesh intervenes, also indirectly, and he orders the temple priestess Shamhat to go out into the wilderness to meet Enkidu and to begin seducing him. And so something very interesting begins to happen. And this brings us to the core of the talk. Through the relationship that is developed between Enkidu and Shamhat, Enkidu is transformed. Okay? Enkidu is transformed. How is he transformed? We will discuss this. Martin Buber explains this quite nicely. He says, man becomes an I through a you. What confronts us comes and vanishes. Relational events take shapes and scatter, and through these changes crystallize more and more each time the consciousness of the constant partner, the I consciousness. Okay, basically what that means is that self-awareness develops in the presence of the other, right? It develops in the presence of the you. So the I always requires another subject that it is engaged with in order to become aware of itself, and in order to develop itself. And it is through the relationship between Enkidu and Shamhat that Enkidu transforms himself from a creature of the animal kingdom to a creature that belongs in the realm of the quote-unquote civilized world, or within the human realm, right? So this brings us to our first theme, right? In terms of what is essential to the human condition. The first is the relationality and self-discovery through relationships. But then this begs the question, well, Enkidu, Gilgamesh was also involved in a relationship, right, with his people. So what is the difference between the relationship of Enkidu and Shamhat on one hand, and let's say Gilgamesh and the brides on the other hand? Remember, the brides that he would take on their wedding nights and rape. So when I was reading this, a movie came to mind, and I believe this movie is based on a novel called Warm Bodies. Okay. And basically the story behind this movie is that you have a zombie, you can tell who the zombie is, named R, and a survivor of the zombie apocalypse named Julie. And throughout the movie, they develop this relationship, okay, a companionship. And what ends up happening, to spoil it for you guys, what ends up happening is that they end up finding a cure inadvertently on how to transform zombies back into humans, right? So it turns out through this text, through in this movie, in the plot, that what made the zombies human again was not some kind of vaccine, but it was when the zombie experienced love, when he experienced companionship. So in the end of the movie, we find these zombies becoming human again, simply by engaging with the survivors at that time, the people of that time. And they end up transforming this lifeless world. So, I mean, it's symbolic basically of what type of relationship makes us human. So what is the difference between the Enkidu Shamhat relationship and the Gilgamesh bride relationship? The difference is, like Martin Buber explains, that the Enkidu Shamhat relationship is the I-thou relationship, meaning that the I sees the other not as an object, something to be exploited, something to be abused, or something to be violated, nor is it something that merely serves a function in the satisfaction of my desires, but the other, the you, right, is a subject, a person, right, which deserves some sort of unconditional, or which deserves that we reciprocate love, for example, right, the element of love. Whereas for Gilgamesh, the you, the other, was reduced to an object. So in the place of the I-thou relationship, we have the I-it relationship. So the bride, the people of Uruk, become an it, they become an object, right? And this is again what we refer to as egoism, the state in which the other is reduced to a merely functional object in our lives. And one of the reasons I want to stop at this point in particular, because this distinction between the I-it and the I-thou is absolutely essential in trying to understand the very nature and the fabric of humanity and what makes us human. And it is also something that is very pertinent to our everyday lives and to the modern condition, to modern man. Now, how is it pertinent to modern man? When you step into a taxi, when you get into the taxi, okay, the first disposition or the first intuition we have in terms of how we relate to the taxi driver is that the taxi driver, for example, I'm giving you an example, is merely an extension of the vehicle. The vehicle being an object, the taxi driver being an object that extends from the car, like the steering wheel or the engine and so forth. Or when we go to grab coffee, right, at the cash register, for example, we have the cashier, and the cashier is seen as an object, an extension of the establishment of the cafe, right? In both cases, the other, the person that is serving us, is understood by their function. They are understood as objects. And the meaning that we project onto them is reduced to the function that they give us in our everyday world. So the function of the driver would be to transport you from point A to point B. The function of the barista or the register, whatever cashier, would be to give you your coffee and so forth, right? Now, there is a possibility, there's always the possibility, and this is what the text is drawing our attention to, that this relationship of everydayness, of objectification, right, of the I-it, can and should be transformed into a relationship of the I and thou. And this occurs when there is, again, some sort of reciprocity, right? An exchange of some sort, right? and this is, one of the reasons, for example, the people find it, especially in the modern world, where we are so absorbed in the self, in this egoism, and in the objectification of the world, right, that we find it difficult to converse with people. That's why, there's in the US, we have this option when you get in the Uber, where before you even get in the Uber, you tell the driver that I don't want to talk, right? Which is very interesting, right? And this is becoming also an increasing phenomena now with this whole COVID pandemic of doing everything online, right? And the ability to mute people digitally, yeah, and avoiding the face-to-face encounter, right? Avoiding the face-to-face encounter, which is so central in the world of objectification and the I-it world and whatnot. So the egoism of Gilgamesh very much still pervades the modern world and our everyday world. The difference is that Gilgamesh had power, right? He had power. He possessed the material power and strength to exert that egoism into despotism and tyranny and so forth. So now, given that the difference between Enkidu and between Enkidu and Gilgamesh is the I thou versus the I it relationship, we can say that the result, the product of Enkidu's relationship is self-consciousness, right? Self-discovery, and authentic self-discovery. Now, given that he becomes human, right, he is immediately ousted from the animal kingdom. The animals no longer approach him, like the text tells us, right? He becomes an outsider. And this might be seen as a sort of triumph, right? That he has gone from the animal kingdom to the human kingdom, or from an animal-like state to a human state, right? But the text draws our attention to something that is at once terrifying, but also beautiful, which is that, yes, he has lost his animal-like nature, but with it comes the loss of animal-like innocence. And in becoming more human, right, he inevitably comes to embrace the alienation, the sense of alienation, which I'll explain what that means, that is central to being human. Now, animals, for example, do not need a sense of belonging, right? Because they cannot experience alienation. Alienation means when you feel misplaced, when you feel out of place, or the feeling or the state in which there is a loss of meaning. Now, for the animal kingdom, this is not an issue, right? Because you have a place in a causal natural order, in the animal kingdom, right? Humans, on the other hand, find that survival, eating, drinking, and procreating is not enough, right? And so being part of the natural world, or having a role in the laws of nature, is similarly not enough. It does not give us the necessary sense of meaning and identity, right? And this is something we all experience, right? As men and women, right? We always try to seek out meaning, or a sense of the self, or a sense of identity that is not limited to breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or procreation, right? There's always this desire to be part of a group, like in Lebanon, the unfortunate issue of the sect, right? And the tribe, and so forth. So yes, animals, humans do have the gift of self-consciousness, but as the text shows us, that this gift also comes with a sense of alienation. It also comes with a sense of losing one's place in the world. And this is what leads us to, like we discussed in the second lecture on the human condition and the where to, right, and the where from, that we try to seek out answers for the self. So now, before we delve into this, right, let's get to the fourth part of the plot of our text, which is that after Enkidu is, thrown out of the animal kingdom, Shamhat begins to teach him how to interact with people. She's preparing him, this new being, Enkidu, who now has human consciousness. She's preparing him to enter the human world, right? The human kingdom. So she begins to teach him how to interact with people. She cuts his hair, she grooms him, she cleans him, and so forth. And she tells him the story of Gilgamesh and what Gilgamesh is doing. Now, Enkidu becomes morally outraged, right? He's morally outraged because, as we have said, that he has developed this self-consciousness, and he has developed this self-consciousness in relation to Shamhat, right? So he's morally imbued, right, to feel this rage when he hears about this king who is objectifying and who is violent and so forth. And so he sets out to fight Gilgamesh. And the two fight it out. They battle one another. And contrary to what the gods had hoped or wished, neither of them is able to kill the other, but the battle ends up actually in a very interesting twist, which is that Gilgamesh ends up loving Enkidu. So here we also have Gilgamesh entering a different type of relationship, a relationship of the I-thou, wherein Gilgamesh now experiences something other than power and lust, right? But this in and of itself is not enough to transform Gilgamesh. It is not enough to transform Gilgamesh, right? Something else needs to be done. He needs another type of shock. Why is it not enough? Because Gilgamesh is still very much embedded, as we said, in the aesthetic life. And in the aesthetic life, right, your meaning and your purpose is derived from what? It is derived from the experience of pleasure and entertainment, right? And naturally, like Kierkegaard points out, Kierkegaard is an existentialist philosopher who first developed this idea of the aesthetic life, who first theorized it. He explains that inevitably this aesthetic life brings about a sense of boredom, right? Because you might, for example, fulfill some desires or and seek out some modes of entertainment, but over time they lose their luster, right? They lose their value. It's kind of like if you're playing a video game for hours upon hours upon hours, right? Eventually it loses you lose interest in it, then you have to jump to another game and another game and so forth. So we find here, right, the Gilgamesh befriends Enkidu, and basically Gilgamesh wants to pursue new modes of entertainment and pleasure, right? And given that he has already entertained himself and sought out the pleasures within his kingdom, whether it's through rape or pillaging or material wealth and so forth, right? He needs to find a new quest. And so he goes about and he takes Enkidu with him on this quest, right? And what's interesting is if you look at the conversations happening between Enkidu and Gilgamesh throughout this quest, which we're going to discuss on Thursday, we find this tension between the ethical Enkidu and the aesthetic, the unethical Gilgamesh. There is a tension throughout. There is a sense of hesitancy, right? Each one is pulling each one towards its own mode of life, but the resolution is never really complete, right? And so, nonetheless, Enkidu follows Gilgamesh, right, in this pursuit for entertainment and for pleasure. And they try to seek out new horizons for pleasure and entertainment, right? New possibilities, right? In the same way, for example, man has traveled the whole, for example, if we look at the recent SpaceX expeditions, you know, the first private ships to enter space, we find here very similar to phenomenon to that of Gilgamesh, wherein we are no longer satisfied with, for example, merely traveling across the world, right, for entertainment or for power or for curiosity, but that we need something beyond. We need to conquer something that is beyond. You know, the famous Adidas slogan, impossible is nothing, right? And so similarly, Gilgamesh set his eyes on a task that is deemed to be impossible, i.e. the killing of who? The killing of Humbaba, right? The great monster of the cedar forest. Now, Gilgamesh sets out thinking that this will bring about a sense of satisfaction and a sense of entertainment, right? What he does not know, which we will see on Thursday, is that it actually ends up being a step towards a transformation for Gilgamesh and a very shock-based awakening towards self-discovery, basically. So we will end with that, and then we will continue on Thursday.